it's crazy, but it's
You're watching Channel Z, the world's leading zombie apocalypse channel, broadcasting live from Studio Z.
Makes me act the way I do.
Welcome to Undead Live, reporting from the front lines of the zombie apocalypse. We have your back morning, noon, and night, whether you're dead, undead, recently deceased, or fully alive. I'm Athena Actipus, and this is Undead Live.
And I'm your co-host, Dave Lundberg-Kenrick.
We are very excited to have a show today about why on earth would anybody choose the zombie apocalypse as a destination?
That's right. Like it could be fascinating, right?
Yes.
Would you go if you had a chance to go see a live zombie apocalypse, right? Would you go watch?
Yeah,
good question.
It's quite a scene, right? So today is the first day also of Innovation Week at ASU. So welcome to all of you who are joining us as part of ASU Innovation Week. We'll be having shows every day this week on things that are related to how you would survive the zombie apocalypse. So today, for example, we're talking about how morbid curiosity can sometimes be a good thing, helping you survive. Later this week, we're talking about how to put together a go bag, especially if you're in the dorms, and a good shelter in place kit. So in case the zombie apocalypse happens while you're at college, you're ready. And we also talk about later this week about how to have a hyper-local holiday. So lots of exciting things coming up this week. And we hope that you guys will join us every day at 10:30 for one of our shows all week this week.
Can I ask you real quick, if you had the option to go spend, like, let's say an hour in a real zombie apocalypse, would you do it?
What kind of protection would I have?
Weapons
or
so
anything?
two options. One,
Okay.
Those little like buses that you can drive through, like a wildlife refuge.
Mm.
You could just drive through one of those, like ride through one of those.
Yeah.
And then the other would be they just drop you in, and then you've got to find your way out. So
I think I definitely would not do the second one. The first one, maybe. I mean, it'd be good to get some information, to kind of see what's going on. Like you do when,
you think you'd be okay, like watching, like, so if you're watching zombies chase people out, like, you don't think that?
Yeah, maybe not. I don't know. But you know what? I think that we should bring on our experts on exactly this and see what they think. Like, would they go into the zombie apocalypse?
All right. And we have two experts with us today, Coltan Scrivner and Matthias Clasen. How are you guys doing today?
Hey, doing well. How are you?
Good. Hey, Coltan, where are you joining us from? And what are your thoughts? Would you get on one of those like wildlife van things and go through the zombie apocalypse?
So I'm in Chicago right now, which kind of feels like the zombie apocalypse and has since about March. Yeah, I mean, I think I would need more information, kind of like what you said, but I think it would be hard to say no if someone offered, right? Like if it was already there, I don't want to make it happen, but if it was already there and somebody said, "Do you want to come?" I mean, maybe.
Sure, right. But if somebody's like, "Listen, I've got an extra ticket for a zombie apocalypse bus trip," what do you say?
So yeah, I would say yes.
You go? All right. What about you, Matthias? Would you want to go?
This is real tricky. It's real tricky. I'm tempted.
Yeah.
This totally relates right to the work that you guys are doing. Coltan, could you tell us a little bit, like, what have you been doing the last couple of months in terms of your research? And, have you essentially been doing something like, getting on a wildlife bus in the zombie apocalypse?
Yeah. So, I mean, given the state of the world right now, it's actually been not too bad for me because the pandemic is kind of a nice way to study morbid curiosity. So I'm a fifth-year PhD student. My main research topic is the psychology of morbid curiosity and also some psychology of recreational horror, which Matthias does as well. And so I've been looking at people's attitudes towards COVID with regard to like how interested they are in it and how that maybe says something about how they're dealing with it. So are people more resilient or less resilient during the pandemic based on how interested they are in sort of end of the world type scenarios.
Fascinating. And how about you, Matthias?
Yeah, so I'm in Denmark right now. So it's actually kind of late night here, and I work with scary entertainment, and that's something I've been working with for a long time now. But I've been collaborating with Coltan on several projects this past year, which has been a lot of fun, very gratifying. So we can tell you more about some of those studies, but they involve haunted houses and the question of whether people who watch a lot of horror movies have better psychological resilience in response to the pandemic, and some interesting stuff.
We have some great comments already from the audience. They're really getting into this idea of what Neil is calling, like, a zombie apocalypse theme park that, you basically get dropped in, and that is also a little bit like the zombie apocalypse RV trip with our show Unreal World, where we have a group of dancers who are planning on taking a trip across the United States in an RV, and when they come out, only wearing hazmat suits. So so there actually are some parallels here, Dave. Maybe you didn't quite think of it. I didn't when you brought up the idea of getting in a van and going through the zombie apocalypse, but I think that's something that Carl Flink and his troupe were sort of thinking about.
That's true. Well, I mean, I was really thinking just in terms of the most exaggerated version of a haunted house you could imagine, right? And so you guys have sort of taken your research out of the lab in a way that I think is really interesting. And so you're talking to people who are going through this haunted house. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah,
Matthias,
Matthias.
maybe.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, because you're absolutely right. When you describe a zombie apocalypse, it does not sound like anything anybody would want to experience. But in fact, almost all of us are drawn to simulations of zombie apocalypses or simulations of worst case scenarios, such as those offered by haunted houses. And while haunted houses or haunted attractions go way back in American cultural history, I mean, the phenomenon is more than a century old. It's relatively new here in Denmark, where I live and work. But there is a haunted house not too far from the university called Dystopia Haunted House, open for Halloween each year. They draw about 5,000 guests in the month of October. And we've been doing research in the haunted house since 2016 because we can get data that we could never get in lab on fear, on the physiology, the psychology, the social dimensions of fear. So that's why it's such a cool thing to go to a haunted house and measure responses on the guests.
You're allowed to scare people at a level that you could never do in the lab, right?
Yep, that's right.
Which is a shame. It'd really be fun to just have a disembodied hand, wouldn't it? To just try to get that past the IRB. Just one that comes out of the computer in the middle of a matching card item. So what sort of like ranges of responses are you getting in terms of, like, first of all, sort of what are you asking people, and what are they telling you?
We've done a bunch of different studies. The first one we did in 2016, where we recruited guests, about 280 guests, and we gave them a challenge to either go through the haunted house and try to just maximize their fear, just let go, become as afraid as possible. And the other half, the other challenge was to try to suppress your own fear. And then we asked guests about their fear levels, about their enjoyment levels, and about the strategies they had used to regulate their own fear. And that gave us a lot of very unique insight into coping strategies that people employ to find just the right amount of fear. And it also gave us an idea that there are different kinds of horror fans or different basic motivations for seeking out scary entertainment. So some people just want maximum stimulation, and we call them the adrenaline junkies. Other people want to seek out a challenge for them to keep fear at a tolerable level and go through an intense experience with their psychological health intact. So that was the first study, and then we did some other more ambitious studies in subsequent years.
So
But
Matthias,
basically,
I have to ask, I mean, if people like go in like to maximize their fear, like are they okay afterwards? Like, or is it, you know, like how is that for people going in with that sort of approach?
it looks like they're okay. I think actually they're more okay than what we call them, the white knucklers, the ones who try to keep fear down. Because in this particular haunted house, there is a safe word or a safe gesture. I mean, if you want out, you go like this. You raise your hands above your head, and a guard comes and escorts you out. And this year, when we did our annual haunted house study, people were dropping like flies. Like 5 to 7% of the guests had to abandon. Some had to be carried out. Some had to receive first aid. But I don't think it's the adrenaline junkies. I think it's white knucklers who become overwhelmed.
So some people are like, they're just trying to suppress their fear, and then somehow that, you think that's what is actually making people kind of freeze or break down when they're experiencing these challenging situations, is that they're sort of fighting against that fear?
That's what we want to know, and that's one of the research questions for which a haunted house is ideal. What happens when somebody gets overwhelmed by a horror movie and faints, like people did when The Exorcist came out in '73? What happens in the mind and the body of people who just drop to the floor in the middle of a haunted house? So when does recreational fear turn into actual overwhelming fear? That's something we can't look at in a lab, but we can look at it in a haunted house.
So can I ask a question about the white knucklers, and also just about people who are getting overwhelmed in fear in general? Why are they going to a haunted house?
Yeah,
is that
that's an excellent question.
Any sense of what that?
Yeah, I think. Go ahead, Matthias.
I just wanted to point out that I'm probably more of a white knuckler than an adrenaline junkie myself. But Coltan could tell you more, because that's actually something we now have some results on.
Yeah, so this year we did look at white knucklers and adrenaline junkies and what they were getting from the haunt. So we asked people when they came out, based on your experiences inside the haunt, ... how do you feel right now? And of course, adrenaline junkies reported that they felt really great. But then we also asked them, do you feel like you've learned something about yourself? And adrenaline junkies don't really learn anything in the haunt. They kind of just go for the thrill, right? The same reason that they might go bungee jumping or skydiving or something like that. White knucklers, on the other hand, don't have too much of a mood boost. It seems like their mood is about the same as when they came in. But they do say that they learn things about themselves. And so when you ask them, okay, well, what did you learn? They'll point to things like learning that they are not as scared as they thought they were, that they kind of psyched themselves out and made it more scary than it really was, or that they can be brave for other people in their group, or face their worst nightmares, things like that.
So they're kind of like morbidly curious about their own reactions almost as much as anything?
Yeah.
Like watching
I think that's probably right. Huh. Yeah, I think that's probably right. And it's interesting because if you show people pictures from a haunted house, I think that if you show people screaming and you ask, like, how afraid are these people? Probably those are not the people who are most afraid. Those are probably the adrenaline junkies, like Matthias was saying, because adrenaline junkies sort of let themselves be afraid. They let themselves scream. They let themselves, get into the narrative. White knucklers, on the other hand, kind of walk around with their knuckles whitened, right? Like just kind of stiff. And so they may look like the more stoic of the group, but it's because of the strategies that they're trying to use to minimize their arousal.
So in a way, can you be like less scared if you really just fully embrace your fear than if you're fighting it at the same time?
Not according to the 2016 study we did, which was published last year, found that the white knucklers reported significantly lower fear levels. So they actively used strategies that actually helped them keep fear down, but they reported similar enjoyment levels. They thought it was almost as fun as the adrenaline junkies did.
And the idea there is that they are able to find their sweet spot, right? By minimizing their arousal, they're able to have more fun at a lower level arousal than, say, a adrenaline junkie who tries to maximize their arousal in order to have more fun for them.
So what do people learn from this, or why do they do this? Why do people approach things that are scary, whether it's, going to haunted houses or, being, not being able to turn away if they see something that's disgusting, or if there's a car crash. So why is it? Why is that part of human psychology? Matthias, maybe you could take the question first.
Yeah, so I think it has to do with, I think it's a form of play. Like we know other mammalian infants find pleasure in play activities, which for a while puzzled biologists, because why would a kitten waste time and energy play fighting? But the scientific consensus is that play is really important for practicing various strategies that might become critically relevant later in life. So kittens actually learn how to handle an assault, a conflict, by play fighting. And similarly, humans seem to be drawn to contexts that allow them to play with fear. So just like Coltan was saying about the white knucklers, you learn something about the phenomenology of fear. You learn something about what fear feels like, what anxiety feels like, how much fear you can handle by watching horror movies and going to haunted houses and so on. So we think it's an adaptive behavior probably that actually teaches people something.
So you're learning about kind of your own response, so that then maybe you're not as overwhelmed by the fear, and you can behave in a way that's more adaptive when you are in a situation that's scary. Is that the idea?
That's the idea, and we have some empirical support for it in the study I was alluding to before, which I think Coltan can tell you more about, where we looked at correlations between horror movie use and pandemic resilience.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add, I think Matthias is right about being similar to play. At least that's my own perspective, is that, if you look across, especially mammals, pretty much every mammal has their own version of play fighting. And I think humans do this, to an extra degree. They kind of do it they use fiction as a way of kind of play fighting with things that aren't real, right? So you kind of play fight with the monster in the movie. And it's not so you can learn how to, escape Jason when he comes after you, but it's maybe more so that you're learning just how to deal with anxious feelings in general, or with scary situations more generally.
So, Matthias and Coltan, we have a question here from Neil Smith. He's asking whether he should be showing his kids horror movies if it really is educational. What's your view on that? Should kids be watching horror movies?
I'm gonna go ahead and say yes. But you want to be
very. You show your kids horror movies?
I've been showing my kids horror movies, yes.
Yeah.
So when we lived right by the ocean, and when they were small, I showed them Jaws to instill in them a healthy dread of the ocean. And I'm only half kidding, because the serious answer is that I think by gradually helping kids build up a kind of media literacy and a tolerance for mediated horror, you're actually doing them a big favor. So you don't want to watch Pet Sematary with your 4-year-old, but you might want to watch like an animated, slightly scary film, and watch it with them and teach them how to approach it, as an artifact. Talk about the sounds. How do the sounds contribute to make you feel what you're feeling right now? That way they won't be overwhelmed when they watch their first horror movie as a 16-year-old. So yeah, I think, just like parents or caretakers in general feel kind of drawn toward enacting basically predation scenarios with their kids, hide and seek, chase play. I don't think it's a bad idea to help kids learn how to handle frightening things through horror movies.
So Neil is following up here. He wants your top recommendations for horror movies for kids.
Yeah, he's going to have to buy my new book, but it doesn't come out until Halloween. But there is a chapter on horror movies.
So one thing my mom always did, that's an easy thing people can do at home, is she would just put like pantyhose over her head so her head would look really squished, and then she would hide like somewhere in the house. Yeah, she would do this, and my older cousin would do this to my cousin Craig and I, and they would leap out at us as we were walking down the hall. And that's really effective for scaring the heck out of your kids. And you know, you can just do that with things around the house. So,
I feel a little.
Go ahead, Matthias.
I just feel bad about telling Neil to buy my book. I think he might, since it's Christmas is coming up, he might want to watch Gremlins, which is part horror, part humor, depending on how old, if he has kids, if it's his own, how old they are. But that might be, one suggestion.
Yeah, I think I would second Gremlins. I also Goosebumps. I loved Goosebumps as a kid. I don't even know if that's still a thing, but surely they still have the movies and the books.
Yep.
Those are great for kids.
And Gremlins is on our agenda for the spring for Brain Dead Theater. So definitely should watch it in preparation for that.
I have a question about the coping mechanisms. Do people just talk about sort of what sort of coping mechanisms worked for them? And are there any that, that you would suggest for kids walking around when their parents are about to jump out and scare them? So, or just in general, actually, so in
that particular study, they told us what strategies they used. We don't have any data on effectiveness, but the strategies fall into three categories: so cognitive, behavioral, and social. And cognitive strategies are strategies that involve you regulating your thinking. So, for example, reminding yourself it's just a movie or just a haunted house. It's not real. It's not dangerous. Or self-distraction is a very common fear regulation strategy. So think of something else. Think of what you have to buy for dinner tomorrow, and immersion is going to be broken, which means lower fear. Behavioral strategies involve covering your eyes, your ears, screaming or not screaming, and social involves interacting with people. But the social fear regulation strategy is tricky because it works in both ways. So sometimes if you're watching a horror movie and you take the hand of somebody else, you might feel comforted. But if that other person is really afraid, that fear might be contagious. So, fear is susceptible to social influences in either direction.
We have I think a really important question here from Pam, which is, how do you sort of deal with these differences between constructed horror and real life horror? And I think this is especially important when we're thinking about the potential adaptive value of morbid curiosity, right? I mean, there's a big difference between going through a haunted house, learning about your own fear response, and then being able to better deal with a scary situation in real life. But for our ancestors, right, other than like your parents freaking you out, there weren't that many opportunities for sort of horror or approaching things that were scary in order to learn about that. You most likely were, getting a good look at a predator, right? Maybe from a largely safe, but maybe not entirely safe distance. So when it comes to this difference between, real life horror and sort of imaginary horror, how do we deal with these differences, and how might the evolutionary basis for them be different?
One real quick comment, if I may, because I'm not sure it's true. I think our ancestors, I think storytelling basically evolved for simulation. And I think it's very likely that our ancestors, for tens of thousands of years, kind of not only told, but enacted threat scenarios, used the verbal medium of constructing terrifying make-believe worlds. But I think Coltan is better equipped to deal with this whole, morbid curiosity cuts across that fiction-reality boundary.
Yeah, I think I agree with Matthias that probably, outside the West, it's hard to imagine how would people engage in, recreational horror without movies or without haunted houses. But I think that's just the way that, we do it, because that's just the way that's easiest for us to do it. It's easy to get on Netflix and stream a scary movie. But as Matthias had mentioned earlier, kids engage in lots of really like scary play. Tag is actually kind of a scary game, especially in a pandemic. If you think about like who's it and if they touch you, now you're it. But also things like hide and seek, or just general sort of exploration. If you kind of explore something that's unknown, or if you go out in the dark, these things can be really scary. And I think that you can play with other kids and have fictional scenarios with your friends where there's a fictional monster that's chasing you, or a fictional monster over there in the dark. And these things can still help you, and I think in the same way that a horror movie could help you. It's just you're not getting the visual stimulation.
In our last couple minutes, we've got some questions from the audience about Santa. They've kind of been coming in at a breakneck pace here. So one is, basically, why is Santa Claus scary, especially for babies? That there's like scary Santas. They can be like scary clowns. The Santa in A Christmas Story, telling the kid he's going to shoot his eye out. So it's the holidays now, right? And Santa is such a thing. This year, because of the pandemic, we don't really have the like mall Santas with the kids, sitting on Santa's lap. But I'm wondering, Santa scary, or like why is Santa sometimes a thing that kids are really excited about and sometimes they're frightened by? And does that have any relation to morbid curiosity?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I think Santa is one of the nicer of the sort of Christmas time creatures, I guess. You have like Krampus, or in Iceland you have I think the witch. What is Grilla? I think is her name, and she like eats children. I mean, there's lots of really bad Christmas time people. Santa's actually one of the nicer ones. But I think when I look at my studies with morbid curiosity, for example, when I look at people who are really morbidly curious, they're not less afraid of whatever thing they're curious about. So they're not, less afraid of the monster or the serial killer. In fact, they're really afraid of it, and that's I think what draws them to it. They just have a higher level of curiosity about it. So you can think of them as this like push and pull. So if you're afraid, you kind of want to pull away from it. But if you're curious about it, you might want to get closer and inspect it. And so it seems like people who are morbidly curious are not necessarily less afraid of whatever thing they're curious about. They just have more curiosity about it.
You brought up this word inspect, which I think is a really important word, right? Because that's something that a lot of other organisms do with predators, right? They will approach them and inspect them. And, do you think for them it's sort of like recreational horror?
Yeah, I think it could be. I think humans as adults do a lot more recreational horror than other animals, because humans play as adults a lot more, I think, than other animals do. But yeah, I think especially with juveniles of other species, I mean, they're kind of cautious, but they sort of, creep up on other things that are scary, especially if their mother is around, right? If they can run back to kind of a safe place, they're much more likely to inspect things that might be dangerous or might be scary, might be a threat.
How about you, Matthias? What are your thoughts on Santa and other, holiday monsters?
I think probably you Americans are to be held responsible for sanitizing Santa. I'm pretty sure his ancestors in cultural history, as Coltan pointed out, were a lot more, directly scary.
And was it always tied to sort of like behavior? Was it like, oh, the witch will eat you if you're not good? Or because I know Santa has a sort of, it's like, look, if you're good, you get good rewards, and if you're bad, you get coal, and
yeah, so he's an enforcer of morality, kind of like the old-fashioned slasher movies from the 80s. Like, have sex and smoke weed, and somebody will come and cut you down. That's sort of what Santa does, just without the hockey mask.
The beard is a little hockey mask looking, though. If it
is.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's a little scary. So, well, I know we're close to the end, but I was just curious, are there any ways, like, so now when people are dealing with like real fears, right? Like, because one thing is trying to deal with like, it's like the pandemic, right? There's a big question among a lot of people's minds. Is this real? Is this not real? Right? I think science generally agrees it's real, but I think it's really hard to picture. Are there ways that we can sort of, like, what would be the one lesson you would say when people are sort of dealing with genuine fear on how to sort of assess it and still,
to be okay, right? Even when things are scary.
Yeah.
I would say think back to what you do. If you've watched a horror film before, I mean, think back to how you dealt with that when you were sitting. I mean, the pandemic is not a direct threat. It's not like coming through your door trying to kill you. And so in some ways you kind of are in a safe setting if you're inside. And the same way that you might be in a safe setting when you're watching a scary movie. So if you think about the kinds of things that you do, so if you maybe try to watch a scary movie and be more aware of what you're doing in order to calm yourself down, what strategies work, which ones don't, some of those might help ease some of the anxiety that you're feeling about the pandemic.
How about you, Matthias? Any other tips for us?
Yeah, I would suggest you watch some pandemic stuff. Zombie movies. To the Lake is a Russian show on Netflix about a pandemic that's worse than what we're seeing. But it's nice to use stories to kind of provide a map.
To see how other people are dealing with it. So
or this idea that it could be worse, right? Like, you know, and if it were worse, here's what it might be like, and therefore, you know, maybe what you would want to do to get ready.
Yeah, or like what to look out for. You know, if it's getting worse, this is what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, Matthias, it will be amazing to have your horror movie holiday list. I think, you know, family friendly, or maybe not family friendly, but family horrifically engaging movies that we can all enjoy together. And thank you both so much for joining us today on Undead Live. And thank you all for joining us for this edition of Undead Live. Remember, the best way to protect your brains in the zombie apocalypse is to share them.
I know it's crazy, but it seems so logical. I can't deny that there is something supernatural with you.